Readiness series. My name is Patrick Shepard, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Cheryl Kane-Piasecki. Welcome, Cheryl.
Thanks very much, Patrick.
And today we're kicking off part one of our massive open online course on seeking and negotiating for employment. As our employees prepare for presidential transition, we need to prepare to assist them in their exit from government service, among at least the appointees. And we want to make sure that you have the tools available to properly counsel those officials. So as part of our Transition Readiness series, we are offering this massive open online class. Today's session one. We'll be back on Thursday for session two, where we'll be going over the exercises. You'll have a day to sort of look over those exercises, give them a try, and test your knowledge. We'll also be back next Thursday for the next broadcast in our Transition Readiness series, where we'll be discussing training strategies for career SES to prepare them for the presidential transition. I think we get very focused on political and presidential appointees coming and going during the presidential transition, but there are some unique stresses that happen for the members of the career SES. We want to talk about some of those issues, such as what are the ethics considerations when you are acting in a position, and likewise, what kind of interactions can you have with former colleagues. So we're going to be giving you some training tools to help you brief those career senior executive service employees to prepare them for those eventualities. Well, we only have an hour today to get started on the Seeking and Negotiating Employment Massive Open Online course. So should we get to it, Cheryl?
Yes, absolutely. If you could pull up the slide deck, that would be great. I wanted to just sort of hop in here and say that I wanted to echo some of the things that Patrick said, which is, in a transition season, we obviously are anticipating a goodly number of our political appointees will be leaving government service. And so our seeking and negotiating and post-employment portfolios for advice and counsel are going to be pretty rigorous and pretty robust. But I would also argue that now, or even before now, we should be doing a training function on seeking and negotiating for employment as well, because I know that in many instances, unfortunately, folks don't find out about that their employees have been actively seeking or negotiating until they come in for post-employment advice. And unfortunately, sometimes that's a little too late for folks, and they may have already tripped over a criminal statute or two before they've ever walked out the door. So my advice to you is, use today's broadcast and the information that we give you in this MOOC to engage in some prophylactic education and training, particularly for your politicals, but kind of agency-wide, because I think that these types of transition phases are times when retirees like to take advantage of the moment to sort of gracefully exit the scene as well.
No, this is definitely an area where we can only answer the questions that come to us, and if we're not sensitizing our employees that they need to come seek advice, all the knowledge in the world doesn't do our agencies any good.
That's absolutely right. And just to let everyone know too, in addition to talking about Subpart F of the Standards of Conduct and obviously the 208 implications that are in the negotiating piece of that, we're also going to be talking about Stock Act notifications as well. So negotiating notifications and recusal notifications for our public filers. So if you were wondering if that's going to be part of today's session, it is indeed, and we'll be getting to it a little bit later. So if we can go to the first slide here, hopefully you all have a copy of Subpart F handy, which is in the Standards of Ethical Conduct 2635.601A, because that's where these restrictions reside, and we really are going to be dipping in and out of Subpart F today. So if everybody could pull their regulations up and go to 2635.601A, because we really need to think about what it is exactly that Subpart F is addressing, or what it is that Subpart F requires. So if we get to 2635.601, this is the overview of the restriction for Subpart F. It says the subpart contains a disqualification requirement that applies to employees when seeking employment with persons whose financial interests would be directly and predictably affected by particular matters in which the employees participate personally and substantially. Specifically, it addresses the requirement of 18 U.S.C. Section 208A that an employee disqualify himself from participation in any particular matter that will have a direct and predictable effect on the financial interests of a person with whom he's negotiating or has an arrangement concerning prospective employment. Beyond this statutory requirement, it also addresses the issues of lack of impartiality that require disqualification from particular matters affecting the financial interests of a prospective employer when an employee's actions in seeking employment fall short of actual employment negotiations. So that's a big, long paragraph that we're going to parse out here in a moment, just so that we can kind of give you clarity on what Subpart F actually does, what it doesn't do, and how you can sort of bring a general sensibility to it. And then we'll be getting into the particulars of each piece of that. So if we could have the next slide, please, Patrick. So when we're talking about the seeking restrictions, we're essentially, Patrick, talking about it's a disqualification requirement, right?
Right. Yeah, it requires us to recuse.
Mm-hmm. And in what circumstances is it required disqualification? Like what has to be present, or really what is the disqualification requirement trying to get to or get at?
So we have the statutory requirement that's referenced in 208, which we're all familiar with. We have a duty to recuse when we're negotiating for post-government employment or employment outside the government. But this seems to extend that a little further and says that when we're seeking employment, which may be prior to a negotiation, we also have a duty to disqualify to manage those appearance concerns, and also I think to protect ourselves from inadvertently coming near to the criminal prohibition.
Right. So, in effect, when we're talking about the disqualification requirement, just as we talk about in 208, what the restriction is trying to do is it is trying to protect government processes. So it's focusing on what the employee can or cannot do for the government when they're in a situation where they are looking for a job outside of government. So if I can have the next slide, please. So I just want to clarify here that it's a disqualification requirement that reaches to the matters that the employee is working on and requires the employee to not participate in certain government matters if those matters could affect the financial interests of someone with whom they're seeking a prospective employment. What it isn't is a requirement that they cease and desist certain job search activities.
So this is very similar to our experience with Section 208, which is that it's not a requirement that you can't hold certain holdings or have certain financial interests. It's a restriction on what kinds of work we can do for the government. So where we have a seeking situation, that restricts the activities that we can do at our agency, or our employees can do for the government. Exactly.
So it is not reaching to whether or not an employee can actually seek employment outside of government. It's not reaching to requiring people to not seek employment. What it is saying is that depending upon the circumstances and with whom you happen to be seeking employment, you may be very restricted in the work that you can continue to do for the government while you are simultaneously seeking employment with a prospective employer. And a little bit later, we're going to talk about what happens in those circumstances, because Patrick, I'm sure you can well imagine circumstances where, particularly when you're dealing with higher level of officials, where depending on who they're seeking employment with, they might be disqualified from an enormous part of their portfolio, such that it's going to be really hard for them to actually continue to do their work and seek employment simultaneously.
No, that's very easy to picture. Depending on the kinds of employment that an employee might be seeking and the kinds of work they do for the government, you could see a lot of overlap there that could significantly constrain their ability to act on the government's behalf.
Yeah, so we are going to talk about what can you avail yourself of? Like, how can you handle situations in which you may have these extraordinary circumstances where someone is seriously, their work is materially impaired because of their seeking employment situation. But I just want to emphasize that the seeking employment restrictions in Subpart F do not prohibit anyone from seeking employment. It's just simply not what the section deals with. Next one. So as Patrick said, and as we just read in 601, Subpart F is effectively implementing two different authorities.
Right.
So it mentions explicitly the 208 and the negotiating and arrangement for prospective employment aspects of 208. So Subpart F is an implementing regulation for 208 with respect to negotiating for and having arrangement for prospective employment. Okay. But it is also broader than that, in that it is also implementing 101J of the Executive Order 12674, which is the principle that deals with an employee shall not engage in outside employment or activity, including seeking and negotiating, that could conflict with their official duties.
And I think it makes sense to group these together in Subpart F, because the way that employees experience this is a sort of a timeline continuum between seeking all the way to negotiating until they finally leave government employment. So it makes sense to house all the restrictions and the implementing regulations together.
It does. And if you can have if you give me the next slide in a minute, and I've tried to come up with some sort of a visual representation of how Subpart F works, because I personally am not a visual person, but I know a lot of people are. So if you think about it this way, okay, Subpart F is the implementing reg for 208. And now 208 is a criminal restriction, okay? And it's only going to kick in once an employee is actually negotiating for or has an arrangement for prospective employment. The tricky piece here is, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more in a moment, exactly when someone is arguably negotiating for employment such that they're actually in criminal 208 land.
Right.
Because we all know a job search, there's a lot that goes on when you're looking for a job.
There can be several steps. It can be rather attenuated. There could be more than two parties involved. So it's tricky to know, when you move from the seeking to negotiating, and we want to be careful about making sure we don't get too close to that criminal line.
Exactly. So the disqualification in Subpart F clearly is intended to reach to the 208 restriction, which is, when you're negotiating or have an arrangement, you're prohibited from participating personally substantially in a matter that could affect your prospective employer. Okay, next slide, please. But what OGE elected to do when in sort of implementing the executive order provisions that also reach to, preventing conflicts of interest when an employee is engaging in an outside activity or negotiating for employment, OGE said, okay, it's really not clear exactly when you start negotiating for employment. So people could be stumbling into a 208 violation without even really being aware of it.
Right.
So what we're going to do is we're going to take that same 208 disqualification requirement, the exact same disqualification requirement, the same criteria for disqualification, and we're going to say, okay, the regulation is going to give you the same disqualification requirement, but a lot sooner. So once you start engaging in pre-negotiation communications toward prospective employment, Subpart F is going to require the same disqualification for you as it would if you were actually negotiating for employment under 208.
Yeah, I tend to think of it kind of like a fence around a swimming pool. There are places inside of the fence where you're not drowning yet, but we put the fence a ways back from the pool to make sure that people are safe and that we don't have people inadvertently drowning in the pool. I think Subpart F kind of does the same thing for the criminal violation that's possible in this process.
Exactly. So if you give me the next slide, please. So that's the rationale behind Subpart F. Subpart F basically says we want to create enough of a prophylaxis so that people are disqualifying themselves from matters well before they could arguably be considered to be negotiating for employment for purposes of actually being in violation of a criminal statute. So as the ethics official, I think there are basically two pieces to the whole when does the Subpart F restrictions, when do they kick in? One is, is the employee actually seeking or negotiating for employment, which is a legitimate question to ask, and we're going to get into that in a minute. But at the end of the day, as the ethics official, the only time we're really, really concerned about whether or not someone is seeking or negotiating for employment is when their employee's official duties can actually affect the prospective employer. So Subpart F does not apply to anyone seeking or negotiating if they don't have duties that can affect the prospective employer.
So we have to have that nexus between the official duties and the prospective employer, much like we would in a 208 analysis, before we really need to worry about the disqualification requirement, because there just wouldn't be anything to disqualify from.
Right. So as ethics officials, I think the official duties affecting the prospective employer piece of the puzzle is the one that we really want to be honed in on. Because let's face it, more often than not, by the time an employee comes to you to ask for advice, chances are that it's probably without question they're seeking employment already, unless they're asking you for when will I trip over this. But at the end of the day, our focus is going to be hugely on discerning whether or not the employee has any matters that they would need to immediately recuse themselves from once they are actually seeking employment. Next one, please. So again, and when we're talking about official duties affecting the prospective employer, folks, this is the same 208 analysis that we do for, any 208 conflict of interest, which is, would the employee be participating personally and substantially in a particular matter? And is the financial interest of the prospective employer going to be directly and predictably affected by that matter? So it's that same basic 208 analysis that we're dealing with here.
So yeah, we're not changing the game here. This should be familiar for those of you who are familiar with 208.
Right. Okay. So the next slide. Now, when it comes to you particularly educating your employees, I would argue that I think the trigger for seeking employment, like when is the employee actually seeking employment, is probably the bigger emphasis, because I think what we want to encourage employees to do is to, the minute they're engaging in an activity that is a seeking employment activity, is to encourage them to, come see you or come get some advice once they know they're actually engaging in an activity that constitutes seeking.
Yeah, that's sort of an unfortunate part about our fence around the pool, is that unless we educate employees about what the fence looks like, it's invisible to a lot of them. So the education point has to be around indicating to employees and helping them to understand when they need to come to us for advice, so that we can advise them about any restrictions that will come from their seeking employment.
Right. So as I said, when we're talking about ethics officials, it might be that our primary focus is on sussing out whether or not they actually have a conflict with their prospective employer. For the employees, I think the key for them, what we really just want them to be able to do, is to discern when they're engaging in activity that might trigger Subpart F, and let you help them figure out the piece about whether or not they have any recusal obligations. Right. So before we get into like what is seeking and what is negotiating, I think it's always really important that we make sure we fully understand the breadth and scope of Subpart F in its totality. So let's take a second to look at the definition of employment, so that we know what types of quote unquote employment activities are covered by Subpart F. So if you look at 603A, 2635.603A, you want to read that real quick for me, Patrick?
So it looks like employment means any form of non-federal employment or business relationship involving the provision of personal services by the employee, whether to be undertaken at the same time as or subsequent to federal employment. It includes but is not limited to personal services and officer, director, employee, agent, attorney, consultant, contractor, general partner, or trustee.
Okay.
That's a longer list than I'm used to.
Yeah, it is a longer list. And I think there are a few things I want to point out here that I think we just need to be really sort of alert to. The first is, obviously, this is dealing with non-federal employment or business relationships. So when you have employees who are seeking employment with another federal agency, I'm not saying that there can't be any appearance concerns to take into consideration, but Subpart F, for the most part, really doesn't apply.
Doesn't contemplate those.
Right. The other thing is that the Subpart F provisions are going to apply not just for people in their post-employment, like post-government employment, seeking job search, but for people who are just engaging in outside employment, that's concurrent with their federal employment.
Right. And I think a lot of employees don't understand this nuance. They say, well, no, I'm not planning to leave government, so I don't need seeking and negotiating counseling, because I won't need post-employment counseling. But it's important for them to realize that this applies regardless of whether or not your activity is going to be taking place concurrently with your federal employment or after.
And then finally, I just would like people to pay extra close attention to that laundry list of, of things that can be undertaken, which involve personal services. I mean, clearly we have officer, director, employee. I think those kinds of things are fairly
We're used to seeing those in the 208 list. In the statute, but these other ones,
agent, attorney, consultant, contractor, general partner, or trustee. So the contractor, agent, consultant, obviously these are not the same as sort of an employer-employee types of relationships that we're used to seeing.
It's more expansive than that.
It's more expansive than that. So just to kind of, just as a heads up, make sure you're aware of all the contexts in which the seeking employment rules might apply.
Right. Basically, if you're engaged in activity looking for personal services for compensation type arrangements, you're there regardless of whether or not the criminal statute names those as imputed positions.
Exactly.
So it's sort of an amalgam of the 502 universe as well as the 208 universe, which I guess is consistent with our goal here, which is to expand these 208 restrictions to those appearance concerns as well.
Exactly. Okay, so we got the next slide, please. So what is seeking employment? And this is the big question, which is, how are we defining seeking employment for purposes of these the provisions in Subpart F? And here, if we look at 2635.603B1.
So looks like an employee has begun seeking if he has directly or indirectly engaged in negotiations for employment with any person.
Well, I don't want to jump the gun here exactly yet, Patrick, but you're right. I mean, and this is a very expansive definition. It goes into when an employee is seeking. It talks about when an employee isn't seeking. It talks about when an employee is no longer seeking. So it's a very expansive definition. So I kind of want to take this a chunk at a time, because I think it otherwise can cause a degree of confusion that when we break it down into smaller chunks may be a little bit more manageable.
Yeah, that does. It goes on for probably 700 words or so.
It's inelegant, shall we say, parsimonious. I don't know. Yeah. It's lacking in those fundaments, I think. So, I mean, and it may seem ridiculous to start with what doesn't meet the definition of seeking employment, but there's method in the madness.
Very well.
So we're going to start with paragraph B1, two little I, A and B, paragraphs A and B.
Oh, there we go. I found it.
Yes. So the first thing that we're going to focus on here is, you are not seeking employment. You have not begun seeking employment if you've only requested a job application. So for any type of employment that has some sort of like a form you have to fill out or an application process, your mere request of an application is not going to be sufficient to trigger the seeking employment. It's not yet seeking employment.
Okay.
And that's fairly straightforward. It's paragraph B that gives people that sort of spins people around and around. The second one is focusing on, you really have to focus on the duties that the employee is performing. Because while submitting a resume to a prospective employer is typically going to be enough to get you into seeking employment, what paragraph B is saying, okay, hold on a minute. If you are working on matters, which we call matters of general applicability, that can only affect an industry, they're not affecting discrete entities, they're only affecting entire industries or class of entities, then merely submitting a resume as a first course of action, you're not yet seeking employment. Okay. You would only be seeking employment once you got a response back other than a rejection to your overture.
Okay, so let me see if I understand that, Cheryl.
Okay.
So if I'm an employee who, I don't know, say I work on regulations, there are particular matters of general applicability, and I send a resume to a company that will be subject to that regulation. And all I'm doing is working on that top tier regulation. I'm not seeking employment until I hear something, and then I am seeking employment for purposes of that regulatory matter.
Yeah, so exactly. And in things like regulations,
right,
and things like policies. And things where the matters themselves are affecting an entire group of entities equally.
Okay. So if I'm the employee, I think that I would like to receive advice anyway.
Right. Exactly.
I don't think I'd feel really comfortable making that determination on my own. So for my purpose, it would probably be enough to say that when I've submitted a resume, I should get clarification about the kinds of work I can continue to participate in.
I think that's exactly right. Because at the end of the day, typically sending a resume is going to be enough to trigger the seeking employment provisions.
Right.
It's only in this case where you've put out a resume to one of several or to several, let's say regulated entities, and all you work on are regulations.
Right.
All we're saying is, unless or until you hear back from one of them, you simply don't have a disqualification requirement. But the minute you hear back from one of them, you're going to have a disqualification requirement. So at the end of the day, my advice again, as you were saying, Patrick, when you're talking to employees, counseling employees, is to not provide them necessarily with this sort of exception to the seeking, but to insist, if you're sending a resume out,
right,
and the advice is, when you send resumes out under seeking employment, we advise you to come talk to us about whether or not you have any disqualification requirements.
Right.
That we don't need to overburden them with this piece, so that they've got to then ferret through whether or not they need to come talk to you.
Right. No, the simple rule of thumb for me is, if I've sent out some resumes, I should come get guidance about the extent of my recusals.
Right.
Because I suppose the other possibility is my duties could change.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I've sent out a resume and I'm asked to work on a specific party matter affecting that entity,
Right.
then I do have a recusal requirement.
Absolutely.
And that's a recusal requirement that I probably need to know about.
Exactly.
So, it's useful to have this so that employees can continue working on regulations, but they should probably think of themselves as doing so with the permission and guidance of the ethics office.
Exactly. No, absolutely.
We do have a question that's come in through the Hangout, and Maddie Parker asks, so this includes employees engaging in outside activities, self-employed, like a CPA preparing tax returns in the evening. They're not really seeking, they are doing in some cases. So I think the question is, during what part of the outside employment process do we look at seeking? And it seems to me, looking at the regulation, that what we mean is when we're seeking those clients, we have to look at Subpart F.
Right.
When we are negotiating for an arrangement with those clients, we need to look at Subpart F with a particular eye towards Section 208.
Right.
And once we've secured that employment, we need to be looking at Subpart E and 208 and Subpart G and all of the other authorities that we look at when we advise employees on outside employment. Exactly.
Because if you look at 602A in the regulation itself, it addresses sort of like the outside employment while a federal employee, and it says an employee who is contemplating outside employment to be undertaken concurrently with his federal employment must abide by any limitations applicable to his outside activities under G and H of this part. Also comply with any disqualification requirement that may be applicable under Subpart D or E of this part as a result of his outside employment activities. So yes, you're absolutely right. It's dead on, Patrick, which is Subpart F applies when you're seeking those or negotiating for those clients. And once you have them, once they are your clients, then you are just we're in the regular
the other 15 rules that we have to think about, or whatever it is.
Exactly. Then you're in the outside activities rules if they apply, and you're into the impartiality provisions.
So this is really just an additional consideration in all of our considerations when we're doing outside activities analysis.
Exactly.
Excellent. Well, thanks for your question, Maddie.
Yes. Okay. So let's move on to the next slide. So just so that we're abundantly clear on what doesn't constitute seeking employment. In the first example, it's John goes to Macy's over his lunch hour and he asks the store manager for a job application to fill out.
John's not seeking.
John's not seeking until he actually submits that application. He's not seeking simply because he asked for one.
Right, and I think that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And the next one is, along the lines of what you had discussed earlier, the example you gave, Patrick, which is Jane is working on a program that will create incentives for the development of alternative fuels. So this program is just looking at a whole different sources of alternative fuels, and it's a program, right? It's just a general program. She has sent her resume to various companies, some of which are ethanol producers.
Okay, so she's just sent her resume.
She has just sent her resume.
Yeah, so I think I'd be comfortable with Jane continuing to work on that program, provided it didn't turn into something more specific.
Right.
So for the purposes of this program, not seeking.
Right, not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. So she would begin seeking, and we'd have to worry about seeking if as you suggested, suddenly now she's working on more specific matters that are not matters of general applicability that affect some of these prospective employers, or B, once she hears back from one of the people to whom she sent her resume, then she's actually seeking employment and would have to potentially disqualify from the program. From the program.
Right.
From the program. Okay, next one. Okay. So when we're talking about seeking beginning, so we talked about what two instances where you're not yet seeking. When it comes to when you're actually seeking, if we look at 2635.603, B1, paragraphs 2 and 3, okay, here's where we're talking about seeking, which is not negotiating, okay? So we're talking about pre-negotiation, when I should have just put pre-negotiation, because that's what we're talking about. Seeking actually begins in its most incipient stages, according to these definitions at B1, 2 little I, and 3 little I. And effectively, what 2 little I and 3 little I are talking about are unsolicited communications. And it says to any person or any person's agent or intermediary regarding possible employment with that person. And then if we go down to 3 little I, it's if you've made a response other than rejection to an unsolicited communication from any person or any such person's agent or intermediary regarding possible employment with that person. So what I've tried to do is translate that into something that might be a little bit more approachable, which is we're talking about unilateral communications. When we're talking about unsolicited communications, we're kind of talking a unilateral communication.
So if I send something to someone, so I'm the employee, I send a resume, I send a letter, I send an email of inquiry, I'm seeking.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. And conversely, if an employer contacts you.
Okay. So I receive an email. Patrick, are you interested, or would you consider? I'm seeking.
You're seeking.
Okay.
Yes. Unless you decline, unless you categorically reject, unless you say, I am not interested.
Shut that off. Yeah.
And the same holds true if you use an intermediary.
Okay.
Okay.
So I say to my headhunter, would you please send a letter to the following companies because I might be interested in working with them? I'm seeking.
Yes. Or if the outside employer is using an intermediary.
Okay, so I'm contacted by Company X's headhunter, and they say, Mr. Shepard, would you be interested in maybe serving as an ethics instructor at our company? And if I do anything except say absolutely not,
you're seeking.
I'm seeking.
Absolutely.
Yep. Okay.
So we're capturing employment prospects at the very beginning stages of when you're actually looking for a job.
Okay.
Okay. So then the next slide. So when does negotiating begin? Now, this is the pickle, and this is the reason why we've created Subpart F the way we have. If we look at 603B1, 1 little I, this is, you can get a sensibility about why this gets tricky, okay? It says engage in negotiations for employment. So you're seeking if you're engaging in negotiations for employment. For purposes of 208, the term negotiations means discussion or communication with another person or such person's agent or intermediary, mutually conducted, I think that's a key phrase there, mutually conducted with a view toward reaching an agreement regarding possible employment with that person. The term is not limited to discussions of specific terms and conditions of employment in a specific position.
Okay.
All right, Patrick, you want to?
So I send the resume
to
Company X, and I receive an email back. It says, Patrick, we would love to meet with you. Could you come over next Thursday for a chat? I'm probably negotiating.
You are probably negotiating.
And likewise, if I hear back from my headhunter who's contacted Company X, and they said, the company would like to know if you're available next Thursday for a meeting, I'm also probably negotiating.
Yes, exactly. So once you're into bilateral communications with a view, with a mutual, conducted mutually with a view towards employment, you're arguably negotiating. And we can try to parse through a whole host of different variations on that theme. And you can understand how thorny that gets. And we're dealing with the difference between a criminal or not criminal, liability.
Like, I guess it's sort of, to go back to our swimming pool analogy, if I'm running towards the pool,
right,
1 second I'm jumping the fence into the yard, and the next moment I'm drowning,
right,
which is why we built the fence.
Right. Right. So we want that fence as far away from the pool as possible, because we're not exactly sure how deep the pool or where the pool begins.
And these things progress very quickly.
Yes, they do.
In the course of a single telephone call, I could pick up the phone and call Company X. And I said, just in case you guys are interested in hiring an ethics instructor, I'd like you to know that I might be interested. And they say, yes, could you come out? Would you consider moving to Phoenix? Then we're definitely negotiating.
Yeah.
And that can happen in a dozen words.
Yes, absolutely. And it can and does happen that fast.
Yeah. So it makes sense that we would try and draw this sort of bright line that once we've made a communication aimed at future employment, we're seeking.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Okay, so we've got a few examples here that I just want to walk people through, just to kind of get, give a feel for where those lines might be. So, Patrick, I've just posted my resume on several online resume posting sites. Am I seeking employment?
I'm not sure who you would be seeking employment with.
What is fundamentally missing here that would make you believe that this can't possibly be like a disqualifying activity?
There's no sort of confirmed recipient of my unilateral communication. Right. So there hasn't really been a communication to our knowledge.
Right.
If they were to see that and call us back or make an inquiry, I think then
we're gonna get
easy.
there. Yeah. We're gonna look at that in a second.
But here, no, I don't think there's a person with whom you could be seeking, right?
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't even identify a prospective employer
right.
unless the universe of people who might conceivably review your resume on one of these online resume posting sites. So posting it alone.
No, and that wouldn't be helpful for us to say you're seeking with the entire world. Because
right, and you have to disqualify from everything because anybody might actually look at your resume.
Yeah,
right.
So that could be a good work avoidance strategy if that were the case.
Okay, so I've just received an email. So I've posted my thing online, and I've just received an email from someone who's indicated an interest in my resume, but I don't like them, so I don't respond.
Okay, I think you're seeking. If there's been a unilateral communication and you've not shut it down.
Well, I don't know. I think I would argue that you aren't seeking, because you've made you know, you've not responded. Like you've made you haven't responded, you haven't affirmed, you haven't given any indication that you continue to want to seek employment. But
well, that's good. So when I post my thing on you know, sort of professional social networking sites or whatever, and I get all this spam garbage, I don't have to go and say no to all of those possibilities. Okay.
Yes, because you haven't made a response. So I think that's the whole thing. It's that it's only if you've made a response other than a rejection.
Okay.
Is that you're actually, but if you've made no response.
If I've made no response.
Yes.
So if I said I'm going to think about it.
Right.
That's different.
Right. Right.
Excellent. Well, that's going to save me a lot of time. I can stop responding to all of those invitations to those direct sales opportunities available now.
Exactly. Exactly.
Great.
Okay. So now I'm going to use a headhunter, or I am using a headhunter, and she just called me and she said, "Hey, you've got 2 prospective employers that are looking at your resume right now. What do you think?"
She hasn't told me who they are.
That's right.
I don't think I'm seeking in this case.
I would agree with you. I think that
I don't know who I'm seeking with.
You don't know who you're seeking with. And again, we have to always remember, in the case of Subpart F, we are focused on preventing employees from working on matters in which a prospective employer has a financial interest. If you have absolutely no idea who the prospective employer is, there is no risk of you having a conflict of interest, because you can't.
Yeah, who am I supposed to recuse from?
Right. Exactly. Okay. So unless or until your headhunter tells you who these people are, if they just generally say 2 people are looking at your resume, that is not going to be sufficient to trigger seeking employment.
Great.
Okay. I just sent my resume to one of our agency's grantees.
Presumably I know which one.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I'm probably seeking.
Yeah, you are probably seeking, or I am probably seeking, because, and this is one of those situations too, where, I mean, if an employee came to you and said, I just sent a resume to one of our grantees, I mean, this again is going to get to our role as ethics officials, which is to say, okay, our concern is, do you have any matters that you're working on that could affect them? Right. And then once you know that, then you can discern whether or not the employee currently has a disqualification requirement, or if it's one of those situations where they're only working on matters of general applicability, and so they're not yet seeking employment. But I would argue if chances are that this employee is probably seeking, since it's targeted to a specific grantee. And actually, that's a sort of a question going back to our last slide, which is, even if your headhunter told you, how is it different from sending your resume, which would not be a trigger. So I think the question is going back to using the headhunter who tells you that 2 folks are interested. So it would be the case if they told us which companies were interested, we would be seeking with those 2 companies. Right. We are just not seeking as long as we don't know their identities. Right. Can we go back to that one? Because I want to clarify. Let me see if I can send this back one. Maybe that might be too large a technical challenge. Okay. Well, okay. Then we'll just. Yeah. Here we go. Yeah. So, okay. Yes, so if you're using a headhunter and they've told you that there are 2 prospective employers that are looking at your resume, I mean, in every single instance, when all you've done is dispatch a resume, that thing I told you about not seeking if you're working on a matter of general applicability and they can only be affected as a matter of class, that will apply here if that's the case. If I'm only working on a matter of general applicability, then the fact that I know who's looking at my resume, and less or until I get a communication from them, I may not be seeking. But as an ethics official, again, you have to let people know that when they might be engaging in an activity where they need to come to you so that you can decide whether or not they have a disqualification requirement. Right. So that's why I want to be really careful. That's why I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about when you're not seeking with respect to those resumes in connection with matters of general applicability. That's for you, the ethics official, to kind of know. Well, the way I think about it is that exception
provides the scope of the recusal requirement.
Exactly.
At the time I send a resume to a company, I do have a recusal requirement with respect to them. I cannot participate in any particular matters involving specific parties that would affect their financial interest or that outside employer. And in the case that I'm working on particular matters of general applicability, those are just excluded from that extant recusal requirement.
Right.
So that changes what the ethics official tells me about the scope of my recusal.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that I don't have a recusal requirement or that I'm not seeking for some purposes.
Well, I think, and OGE is trying to sort of like clarify this, I think, in our proposed changes to Subpart F. And what I understand OGE is doing, what we're doing in the revisions to Subpart F, is rather than say, oh, in those circumstances where you're working on a matter of general applicability and you send it to one of the people who's affected by that matter, you're not seeking employment. We are instead saying, yes, you're seeking employment. Anytime you send an unsolicited resume to someone with the view towards employment, you are seeking employment. What's affected, what the matters you're working on will affect is whether or not you immediately have to disqualify. So it's trying to switch the focus from saying it's not seeking to just saying it is seeking, but it's a seeking situation where you don't immediately have to disqualify.
Right. That makes sense. And to get back to Enrique's question, if your headhunter in this case said that company X and company Y are contemplating your resume, you would be seeking with company X and company Y in this case, because now we know their identities. But in the case here, where we just know that two prospective employers, who could be anyone in the world,
right,
we don't have a recusal requirement because we don't know the identities of the prospective employers yet.
Exactly.
So yeah, Enrique's question is a good one. Thanks for helping us clarify that.
Okay. So we can go down to, I think it's like 5.
There we
okay.
go.
A friend of mine just called and asked me to send him my resume for a job opening at his office.
Unsolicited communication. I'm gonna have to do something here. I guess it depends what I said. So if I said, "Go away, friend, I don't want to work with you, never in a million years," not seeking. And if I said, "Let me pull it together and have someone proofread it real fast," I think I'm probably seeking then.
No, I think absolutely. I think that, once you've had someone explicitly ask you to send their resume because they have a job opening that they're considering you for, and you send them a resume,
right,
you're in bilateral land. And I'm not saying you're negotiating yet, but I do think you're definitely seeking.
Definitely getting close.
Yeah. Next one. Okay, after our status update meeting with the private contractor, one of the contractor employees asked me if I'd like to come work for them on a similar project.
I think, again, unless I sort of respond and say, absolutely not, no way, anything else, I think I'm seeking here, and probably also moving
very
quickly in the direction of negotiating, because they're talking about specific work already.
Exactly. So you're in a situation here. It's a unilateral communication from a prospective employer about employment, and unless I immediately say, no, thank you, I'm not interested, or something that other makes it perfectly clear that no, I truly am declining, any job opportunity, I am seeking employment. And what's the problem with this, Patrick, if I'm seeking employment in this situation?
Well, we're at a meeting with them right now. So it would seem that I'm immediately working on a particular matter that affects that contractor.
Right.
So I'm going to have to find a way, if I'm going to do something other than reject this outright, recuse myself really quickly. So this might be a good learning point for employees who might find themselves in this situation, because that's kind of uncomfortable. So if we went back to the meeting and I had to let me think about it, I could potentially violate Subpart F or even Section 208 on the same day.
And that's exactly the point, which is, and then I think that we need to remind employees of that, is whenever they're approached about a job possibility, particularly, with a prohibited source for the agency, a regulated entity, a contractor, a grantee, whatever, that, they are in a position that unless they say absolutely not, they're seeking, and then they have an immediate disqualification from that matter. I think we better keep moving here. We're running out of time. Okay, so that was just to give people a flavor of like how you make determinations about when an employee is seeking. So seeking employment ends. 603B2, 1 little I and 2 little I talk about 2 circumstances in which explicitly where seeking employment ends. First is where the employment is rejected. by either party.
Right. We've talked about that a bunch.
Yes.
We say no way, or they say no way.
Right. Or the employer has expressed no interest within 2 months of dispatch of a resume. So if I send a resume out and I don't hear anything for 2 months, after that 2 months has expired, I am no longer considered to be seeking employment.
Right. But I would resume seeking if they contacted me.
If they contact you, then that triggers the seeking
again.
The seeking again.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay. In terms of any remedies for a job search conflict of interest, it's going to depend on the facts of the situation, and it's going to depend on where the employee is in the seeking employment process. So if the next slide, please. And this really gets down to if you were ever to want to give someone either an authorization to continue participating, notwithstanding that they had a conflict of interest with a prospective employer, or in the case of if they're in negotiations, if you wanted to issue them a 208B1 waiver. There's a legal advisory that I've given you a copy of as a reference tool that you were sent a copy of, and that's on the website. And I'm going to make reference to it a little bit later when we get into the Stock Act. But it walks through the considerations for waivers or authorizations. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it here. What I do want to say are two things. One, you cannot give an authorization to someone who is actually negotiating for employment. An authorization is only going to cover a circumstance where an employee has a conflict of interest or an appearance of a conflict by virtue of pre-negotiation seeking employment. A 208 waiver would be necessary once the person began negotiating. And I think OGE takes sort of a jaundiced eye towards 208 waivers. We think they're very difficult to meet the standard. We're not saying it's impossible, and it's the agency's discretion to issue waivers in all circumstance, frankly. But OGE basically says you have to take in consideration not only the employee's interest in the financial interest in the prospective employment, but the entire financial interest of their prospective employer is imputed to them. So you have to calculate what the financial interest to the prospective employer is. And we just think those two things combined makes it really difficult at times to come to the determination that the interest in future employment is not so substantial to affect the integrity of their service.
Right.
And when you have a presidential appointee in particular, presidential appointees who Senate confirmed, you cannot issue a 208 waiver without consulting first, not only with OGE, but the Office of Counsel to the President. So that's just a practice that you need to be aware of. We talked a little bit about at the beginning where you can't compel someone to stop looking for seeking employment. But if you have a situation where someone it can be materially impaired in their ability to do their job, we have a provision at 604D where you can make a determination of substantial conflict. And what that provision essentially says is if someone is materially impaired from doing their job, you can basically say that they're going to have to take annual leave, they're going to have to be on leave without pay, or you can completely reassign them as a way of kind of a workaround to if they have such a conflict by virtue of their seeking or negotiating that they can't actually complete their job.
So if I'm only working on, the only thing I do here at OGE is work on a project with company X, and I decide I want a job with company X, so I'm seeking or negotiating. So I say I'm just going to sit in my office and play video games all day. You can say that's not going to work, Patrick. You either have to take annual leave, or we're going to have to reassign you, or you're not getting paid.
Right. Exactly.
That makes sense.
In terms of deferring the job search, again, you can recommend that, but you again cannot compel an employee to defer a job search that they wish to engage in. We find that this might be an avenue that you want to at least discuss, particularly if you're dealing with a high-level official who happens to be responsible for sort of entire agency programs or any major program area where it would be difficult, if not impossible, or be hugely disruptive to have them recuse themselves.
Right.
And again, we discussed that in the legal advisory that I mentioned earlier. It's a 2004, I believe, legal advisory, which I've given you a copy of. So if you think that that's an avenue that you might not need to avail yourself from, again, it would be something to discuss with OGE.
Right. No, especially if you have employees who want to be able to work and fully function till the very end of their term or their appointment.
Right. We also have a provision which we in the vernacular call a sour grapes provision, which is in 2635.606B. And this is where an agency at its discretion can actually extend a recusal obligation or even engage in a reassignment, even after negotiations have ceased with a prospective employer. So let's say that somebody's been in the throes and in the heat of seeking and negotiating for employment with someone, and it falls through.
So I go out to Palo Alto to talk to Company X. We have a nice weekend. I think it's going really well. And all of a sudden they drop the hammer and say, no way, Patrick. And then I come back and I want to work on the project with Company X.
Yes.
And I'm bad too.
Yes. I mean, and that's one of those things where, I mean, it's just an acknowledgement of human nature and hard feelings being what they are. Just like we don't want you working on it if you really want the job and you want to try to curry favor with them. Likewise, we don't want you working on it if you have a horrible attitude about them and really might want to do them harm.
So you will not allow me to come and inflict my revenge upon them through the government contract.
So agencies at their discretion can require a continued disqualification for whatever period of time they want to specify to give the person a chance to chill and cool out. And that's all outlined in 606B. And how you decide which remedies you're going to use obviously is going to depend on the employee's position, their level of responsibility, but more importantly on what's in the agency's best interest. I mean, it's really a matter of if you have other employees who can fulfill the function, you should go the recusal route. You know, if there are other positions that the person can hold, you should consider reassignment. So it's really going to, but you always should be doing what's in the agency's best interest. Right. Okay, so that's it for seeking and negotiating for employment in Subpart F. So now we've got a glom on top of that, Stock Act notifications.
Awkwardly.
Awkwardly, yes. Okay. So Section 17 of the Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge Act applied a negotiating and recusal notification requirement to public filers. And what I just want to just do a general highlight, because we've given you a one-pager on the Stock Act. We've given you a copy of the legal advisory that we issued on Section 17 of the Stock Act. So this is just kind of a broad overview to kind of like help you orient yourself before we get into any exercises. So a few things. Section 17 of the Stock Act applies both to negotiations or agreements. And it's not just for employment, it's also for compensation, both of which have to be post-government. So if someone is simply looking to engage in an outside activity for compensation or outside employment that's going to be concurrent with their federal employment, that is not covered by Section 17 of the Stock Act. Section 17 is only reaching to when there are negotiations or agreements for post-government compensation or post-government employment. So the employment services or the compensation services have to be ones that would commence after government service terminates.
Okay.
Okay, so next one. So what is compensation? Compensation is something that will be given in exchange for the provision of personal services. So it can be, and it can be a lot of different things. It can be any form of consideration. It can be a fee. It could be an honorarium. It could be a salary. It could be royalties, including it can include forms of transportation, lodging, and meals if they're being offered in exchange for the services.
So basically, we focus on whether or not these things are compensatory in nature.
Exactly, exactly. So who must file? Basically, it talks about covered employees, and a covered employee is very simply anyone who's required to file a public financial disclosure report. So it's your public filers are the ones who are going to be required to engage in these negotiating and recusal notifications.
Easy threshold question. If I'm advising someone, are they a public filer? If they are, I have to worry about this.
So we issued this legal advisory. I've given you a copy of this, and this gives you it's a sample of a notification statement that you can use if you want to. It outlines what that notification requirement is. You could go down to the next slide, please. Clearly, we have both the notification of negotiating for employment or compensation, in addition to the notification of recusal statement. We have them all on the same page. The fact of the matter is they don't, and we're going to talk about this in a second, they don't necessarily have to be filed at the same time. So let's say that someone is engaging in a negotiation, and within 3 business days after they begin negotiating, they have to file this notification of negotiation for post-government employment. It may very well be that at the time that they sign this notification, they don't have a conflict of interest, so they don't necessarily have to sign the recusal statement.
So there's never been an instance of recusal.
There's never been an instance of recusal, and there's no necessarily any reason to believe that there need to be a recusal. Or it could be if there is a situation where you fully suspect that a recusal may be required, you can sign the recusal statement at the same time.
Right.
Because the recusal statement is basically just saying that as long as I'm negotiating or have an agreement, I will comply with the recusal obligations. And that's all. It's a simple statement.
Right.
I acknowledge I have a recusal requirement.
And that makes sense. And that exists regardless of the statement.
Right. Okay. So when do the employees have to file these? With the negotiation notification, it has to be within 3 business days after the commencement of the negotiation or agreement for future employment or compensation. Okay, 3 business days. The recusal, as I just said, whenever there's a conflict or the appearance of a conflict with the non-federal entity listed in the negotiation notification. So when you believe there to be an appearance or an actual conflict with the entity that's being identified in the negotiation statement, then a recusal notification has to be filed as well. Now, OGE has suggested, I know a lot of agencies are doing this, and I believe even in the revisions to Subpart F, which are going to contain the implementing regulations for these provisions. So those are going to be part of the revisions to Subpart F. We suggest that the public filer may elect to file the notification statement before negotiations actually begin, or before an agreement of future employment or compensation is reached. And it's for exactly the reasons that we just have been talking about for the last hour.
For Subpart F, which is because then we have one bright line, right? When you start the seeking process, let's just take care of all of this. We'll explain your recusal obligations, which exist whether or not you talk to an ethics officer.
Right.
And get this all taken care of.
Exactly. And again, it's for the same reason that we don't have a bright line definition for what constitutes negotiating. So if once employees are actually starting to engage in some of the employment search activities and communications, just file one of these negotiating forms, and then you're safe. Now, OGE has said as well that if you do it in advance of actual negotiation, then you're not required to file a subsequent form once you've actually started negotiating. So it'll take care of you through negotiations and your arrangement.
So the middle of that phone call, when you call me from company X and say, Patrick, would you be interested? Okay, so I'm merely seeking now, and in 2 seconds I'm going to start maybe negotiating. We don't have to parse those minutes. We can just say, you've had a communication aimed at post-government employment. Let's file the notification.
Let's file the notification. And similarly with the recusal statement, we say the filer may elect to do this before they actually have a conflict of interest or an appearance of conflict of interest. So I would just argue, I think it's just makes sense that when the employee files the statement, the negotiation notification, just do the recusal statement at the same time, because again, all it's acknowledging is that the employee recognizes that they have to abide by the law and that they will recuse themselves in the event that they have a conflict or the appearance of a conflict.
Which is true whether they fill the form out or not.
Right. Now, some people might say, well, I don't want to lead people to believe that this is actually an appearance or a conflict if it isn't.
Right.
And I understand those concerns. And so I'm not saying you have to. And that's why we're saying you can't compel people to do this. You're not required to issue a recusal statement if you don't, in fact, have an appearance or a conflict of interest.
But you may elect to, sort of for administrative efficiencies and for not spending your whole life at the ethics office.
Exactly. There's no filing required after negotiations have been unsuccessful or an agreement has been terminated. So it's only catching the active, negotiation or agreement. And once that's terminated, you're not required to file. Now, you might want to let the ethics office know, just so the ethics office knows.
Right.
But you don't have to. And with whom do you file? You file with the agency ethics office, with an agency ethics official. Now, one thing I would, just suggest is that the employee is not required, and there's nothing that requires the employee to inform the employee's supervisor. But clearly, if the employee has a recusal requirement, keeping that from the supervisor is probably not advisable or maybe even practicable. So we always encourage people to consider contacting their supervisors and informing their supervisors in addition to contacting the agency ethics official.
Excellent. So that was a lot. That was a busy hour.
So what we are leaving you with then is we have a workbook that we've given you. We sent you the workbook, and it's also posted on the max.gov site. And we've given you a series of exercises to work through. And what we would like to ask you to do, if you can scroll down on that, Patrick. and this is for Thursday, is we would like you to just take a look at the scenario that you've been given. We want you to make some determinations about whether or not you think the employee is actually seeking employment, whether they have duties that could affect the prospective employer. So here we're trying to get at, is there a recusal requirement? Whether or not they would be someone who would be subject to a negotiating notification. So for that piece, we want to know, A, is this person possibly subject to it? And then B, do we think that they're negotiating such that they should be filing a notification? And then again, the recusal notification. Do we think that the circumstances are such that they would be required to issue a recusal statement as well? And we have, I think,
five exercises. It looks like
5 exercises for you all to go through.
Do that process for each of the 5.
Yes.
And then we'll be back on Thursday
Mm-hmm.
To go over those exercises.
Yes. So we will see you back here, same place, same time on Thursday to go over the exercise.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us, and we will see you on Thursday. We hope you find this to be helpful and find it to help you can work through the exercises. And we do have a couple of minutes if there are any questions on the phone or the Hangout. Cheryl, I'd be willing to hang around if you need clarification. If there are questions or clarification.
Certainly. At this time, if you'd like to ask a question, please press star then 1. Please stand by.
It doesn't look like we have any questions on the Hangout. But it is interesting. I think as we focus on the process, sort of the temporal steps that employees engage in as they move towards non-federal employment, this stuff becomes much clearer than if we kind of try and work by parsing the concepts in the regulation. I think it's a regulation and a sort of set of laws that are really structured to facilitate a procedure.
Yes. Yes, I agree.
Excellent. And I'm not showing any questions on the Hangout. Do we have any questions on the phone?
We do not, sir.
Okay.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you back here same time on Thursday to go over the exercises.
Thanks
Thanks,
very
Cheryl.
much. Bye.